It's such a joy to come to community events like this, even given the circumstances, because over the years that I've worked in the neighborhood, I've gotten so much from going to community meetings and community events. And I grew up in a small town, and my entry into working in the downtown east side was that it actually reminded me of being in a small town, much that I grew up in, and in a way it was a part of Vancouver I felt extremely comfortable in, and its history is something I continue to be inspired by, and the work on this mural and the history of struggles around it are something that still shape the psyche of the city, and in fact it's still a place where we can learn about compassion in the city. And the two events that I'll talk about, the Carnegie Strike and the On to Ottawa Trek, are two amazing things that set really a kind of national narrative around what was happening in the mid-30s. Last year, one of the last remaining survivors of the On to Ottawa Trek was a guy named Al Dugas, and he passed away last year, but prior to passing away, he was interviewed by David York, the president of the On to Ottawa Historical Society, and he told these amazing stories about jumping on the boxcars. And at the very end, he started reciting a song, and this was literally a few months prior to passing away, and I've never really sung in public, but I'm just going to speak or mumble a couple of stanzas. It's a song called The Red Flag. Then raise the scarlet standard high, within its shade we'll live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. It waved above our infant might, when all ahead seemed dark as night. It witnessed many a deed and vow, we must not change its color now. Then raise the scarlet standard high, within its shade we'll live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. Last year there was a group from the community. We were lucky enough to be supported by the labor movement to be able to go to Ottawa in a commemorative trek, and we were inside the rail cars, and so it was symbolic as opposed to what was happening back in the 1930s. But just for a little bit of background, back in 1931, a couple years after the stock market crashed, 57,844 out of 234,000 working people were unemployed. So almost 25% of the population were out of work in a context where there were no social programs there to support people. If you were of working age and male under the age of 30, you were sent out to work camps. And it was in this context people didn't have the right to vote. It's also where the national park system was built up, places like Banff, the Hope-Princeton Highway as well. And under this extreme duress, people began to organize. The International Workers of the World, a very militant union, was organizing, and people struck from these work camps around BC and came to Vancouver by December of 1934 and began to do different strikes and demonstrations, and more people joined. And by March, the mayor, McGeer at the time, read the Riot Act right in Victory Square. The City Hall at the time is where the Dura building currently is. The following month, in a campaign for 3 days relief, so essentially this would be 3 food coupons you'd get for a day to be able to eat. About 250 people stormed the Carnegie Center. And in the archives of the Vancouver Library and City Archives, you can see this famous photograph that's being alluded to in the mural, which is that as these people were inside occupying, their family members and supporters brought food, clothing, other types of things in a basket. It was raised up to the window, and it was an iconic shot at the time. And as these meetings continued, there's other amazing photographs of that era where the Anglican Church had a soup kitchen, and they wouldn't serve the Chinese community. And it says, when do we eat, or what the placards say. And it reflected some of the racism of the period as well. At the back of one of these meetings, which oftentimes, it's interesting how people organize now with like internet and Facebook and these types of things, but then people actually wore sandwich boards walking around Hastings and Carroll to tell people that a meeting was happening in the evening. And at the back of one of these meetings, there was the debate at the time, is it a city issue, is it a provincial issue, which still kind of happens today. At some point, someone in the back of the room said, "On to Ottawa." And people started organizing around that beginning in May, and then on June the 3rd at the foot of Main and Hastings, a few thousand people jumped on the boxcars of the trains, and with the fumes and the weather and everything, they went into places like Kamloops and Golden, and more people kept on jumping on the train. The Toronto Star at the time was a big critic of a right-wing Prime Minister at the time, R.B. Bennett, a right-wing Prime Minister from Calgary. I don't know if we've ever heard that story before, but they chronicled it through a series of articles as they jumped in Calgary. More people joined on. Eventually they were stopped in Regina, and a delegation was allowed to go meet with Prime Minister R.B. Bennett. And after that meeting, which went really badly, they went back to Regina, and on Canada Day, what was meant to be a peaceful demonstration was attacked by the police in Regina and the RCMP, who had used that time that they had taken to go to Ottawa to reinforce. So this is a story about people from Vancouver speaking out against injustice and leading the charge for what would become later the opening up of social programs, things like pensions, unemployment relief, public health care. And that story about Vancouver's role in that is a really amazing one. Thank you so much, and really been a pleasure to be here this afternoon.